How to fight corruption. Imprison 3 of your friends. Need economic growth? Then it's better to trade with your neighbors rather than go to war with them. How to succeed when there are no resources. You must work hard and rely only on yourselves. All these pieces of wisdom were born in a small country that, just 50 years ago, was considered an artificial entity without its own people, without natural resources, and surrounded by unfriendly neighbors. We will tell you about this country in this video right now. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll continue. No one believes in the future of Singapore except for Singapore itself. Here, they will defeat corruption, the world's largest companies will come to do business, and the country's residents will become richer, more educated, and live better every year. This is Singapore at the moment of its independence. A typical Asian picture with slums and poverty. Why? Because Singapore essentially has nothing, no natural resources that can be sold reliably like oil or gas, nor a normal-sized territory. The state is not even the size of a large city. Moreover, it lacks basic necessities like fresh water and even food. Therefore, people live there in poverty. For context, GDP per capita, essentially the main indicator of any economy's success, in Singapore at that time was only $400, slightly more than Costa Rica, even less than Jamaica. However, Singapore has an excellent geographical location right on the main trade route from Europe to Asia. Actually, this is why the British invented Singapore during the times of the East India Company, to make trade more convenient. And within a couple of decades, this place becomes the main stronghold of the British Crown in the Far East. All because the colonial authorities declared it a free port. That is, there were no duties or taxes, and therefore, more and more merchants arrived, and more goods passed through Singapore. But after World War II, the British Empire finally collapses, and the colonies gain independence. India, African countries, Malaysia, and Singapore all together. And when a major power leaves, someone else wants to take its place. And if we compare it with its neighbors, nearly 100 million Indonesia or 10 million Malaysia, Singapore is small and weak with a bunch of problems. For example, housing. Or rather, just slums. Unemployment is at 10 to 12%. And essentially, there is no single Singaporean nation. The country's population at that time was 75% Chinese, 13% Malays, and 8% Indians. That is, there were no Singaporeans in Singapore. Naturally, most people did not believe that the country would survive and remain independent. But everything changed with this man. Lee Kuan Yew ruled for 30 years, from 1959 to the 1990s, transforming Singapore from an underdog to the most prosperous country in Asia and the world. How did he do it? The first principle is not to ask for help but to offer yours. In the 20th century, there is one resource that everyone needs: oil. But remember, Singapore has no oil. Disaster? No. Big and respected oil companies like Shell and Esso come to the country one after another not just to sell their gasoline. What did they forget in Singapore if there is no oil there? The local government offers very favorable conditions to open oil refineries there. Remember the excellent geographical location and that Singapore has always been a free port. As a result, Singapore becomes one of the largest oil refining centers in the world. But it's not just about oil. Lee Kuan Yew writes, "We grabbed at any idea that could create new jobs and provide people with a livelihood." A vivid example is that Singapore is happy to welcome even a small company from Norway that wants to produce fishing hooks there. Consequently, several hundred new jobs are created, and every year millions of hooks of all shapes and sizes are produced. But, you must agree, you can't build a powerful economy on fishing hooks alone. Somehow, it was necessary to attract large multinational corporations. To this end, Singapore created the Economic Development Board. It sought investors worldwide and resolved any issues for those who could invest in the country. The second principle is to invest in areas where breakthroughs are possible. In 1969, 3 significant events happened for civilization. Humans landed on the moon, scientists connected 2 remote computers for the first time, creating the prototype of the future internet, and engineers from Silicon Valley placed the first microprocessor on a thin wafer, sparking the digital revolution. However, Singapore managed to achieve a breakthrough a year before these landmark events. In October 1968, a delegation from Texas Instruments arrived on the island. They were looking for a profitable and convenient place to manufacture their semiconductors and microelectronics. They were the first to open a factory in Singapore. A year later, HP did the same, followed by General Electric. Within just a decade, when the computer boom began worldwide, Singapore would already be one of the largest exporters of microelectronics. At the same time, a new global financial center began to grow. The logic was simple: the financial world woke up in Zurich at 9 a.m. When banks opened, then banks opened in London, and a bit later in New York. When Zurich closed, financial flows from London and New York moved to San Francisco. But there was a problem. When San Francisco closed, banks in Zurich were not yet open, meaning nothing happened in the financial world during this period. This gap was perfectly filled by Singapore. While banks in San Francisco were still open, Singapore took over the baton. And when the banks in Singapore closed, they could transfer financial flows to Zurich. Thus, a global 24-hour banking service was launched for the first time in history. Brilliant. The third principle: talented people are the most valuable asset a country can have. Lee Kuan Yew did everything to make Singapore an oasis for people from developed countries. You remember, Singapore has an excellent location and climate. But healthcare, education, safety, transportation, and services had to be as good as in the UK or the USA so that entrepreneurs from those countries would voluntarily come to do business and invest their money in Singapore. For this to happen, Singaporeans themselves had to meet these standards, which meant providing them with good education and decent wages. A crucial decision here was to prioritize the English language in both business and education. The country simply could not have survived if people communicated and studied only in Chinese, Malay, or Tamil. As Lee Kuan Yew would say, everyone must learn English, and their native language should become their second language. English would solve two important tasks for the country. First, it would unite the different ethnic groups in Singapore, and second, it would serve as a passport to the world of international business, diplomacy, science, and technology. Additionally, the Singaporean authorities adopted another excellent principle that American companies love. It's called the Green Harvest, where the most promising students from different countries are offered jobs in Singapore even before their final exams. Naturally, many like this idea and choose to stay. The fourth principle: even a small amount of power creates incentives for its misuse. Yes, you've probably heard that Singapore defeated corruption, although, according to Asian traditions, people there also love to take, give, and conceal bribes of any size. The first thing Singapore did was to classify almost anything of value as a bribe. Second, if the court sees that you are living beyond your means, with an excessively expensive house, car, or watch, the investigation doesn't need to prove anything. The mere fact that you somehow acquired these items proves you are taking bribes. Third, investigators are given extensive powers to check not only the official but also everyone around them: wives, children, agents, and relatives. Fourth, fines for corruption were increased from an already impressive 10,000 Singapore dollars to an astronomical 100,000. Anyone who hides information about bribes or tries to confuse the investigation faces huge fines or goes to prison. And fifth, and most importantly, local officials at some point became the highest paid in the world. So, it was simply unprofitable and dangerous for them to take bribes. The fifth principle: every citizen should have a share in the country's wealth and a place in its future. One of the main problems of early Singapore was housing the slums. There were many of them, and they were very large. To give you an idea, in 1961, a single fire destroyed an entire neighborhood and left 16,000 people homeless. Lee Kuan Yew had a solution for this: build quality social housing for people so that the residents would not rent it but own it. I wanted our society to consist of homeowners. I was convinced that if each family owned their home, it would make the situation in the country more stable. As a result, over 30+ years, Singapore built 750,000 apartments through various government programs, and only 9% of them were for rent. The rest were owned by the residents. Naturally, Singapore did not become a paradise on earth. The higher the salaries and standard of living, the higher the prices. Today, Singapore ranks third among the most expensive cities in the world, with only Tel Aviv and Paris being more expensive. However, salaries in Singapore are higher than in these two cities by an average of $1,000. Moreover, Singapore remains one of the top places where it is easiest to start and run a business. Low taxes and fair competition conditions attract companies and money from all over the world. Thus, Singapore continues to grow both economically and physically. Here, as in Dubai, they reclaim land from the sea, creating artificial islands. We had no natural resources. We only have people living on a small, strategically important piece of land. Remember, people are the most important resource and the key to the future. That's all for now. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and see you next time.